Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined-up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. Thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a weekly show featuring interviews with fantastic authors sharing their personal stories on how and why they write. There's hints and tips for aspiring writers and great book reviews from top bloggers. Follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast. Right, cue the cheesy theme tune.
Put down your pen and stop your typing. Grab yourself a drink, 'cause it's Joined Up Writing.
Yes, hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 90 with friend of the show, Melanie McGrath, who writes both fiction and non-fiction. Today we focus on the latter, with Mel giving a fascinating insight into her process and why she's so passionate about telling what she calls the stories about people like us. I also want to give a massive cheer to all of you currently having a crack at NaNoWriMo. That's National Novel Writing Month for the uninitiated, and it's been fantastic to connect with so many passionate writers, old and new, throwing themselves into the challenge of writing 50,000 words during November. And on that very subject, I wanted to mention Martin McConnell and his team over at nanoinspo.org, who've put together a crack team of writers and inspirational folks to give you that extra push over the line. It's totally free to sign up, and you'll get inspirational emails and support from the team, so check out nanoinspo.org or the Twitter hashtag nanoinspo, and that's NANOINSPO. And I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. On the same theme, you can also find a series of blog posts from us at Joined Up Writing, and I'll continue to tweet advice and inspiration throughout the month. And next week, that's November 13th as I record this, there'll be a bonus Nano podcast episode with my writing buddy, collaborator and Nano veteran Maria Smith, where we'll give you a rundown of some of the ways you can smash Nano, but also successfully complete that difficult first draft. And that's part of a wider project that me and Maria are working on at the moment, and I'll be giving you more information about that in the coming weeks and months. So a quick update from me before we jump into today's interview. Despite all my cheering from the sidelines, I'm not actually taking part in Nano myself, as I'm fully immersed in the very last section of the edits on my crime novel, Safe Hands. I won't lie, I've been wobbling a bit, questioning some of the aspects of the climax of the story, which has slowed me up a little bit. But after a really helpful chat with the aforementioned Maria yesterday, I'm feeling much more positive. Partly because Maria was and is a very positive sounding board, but also because saying it out loud actually helped me to get a better grasp on what I'm trying to articulate through the themes of the book, and it also confirmed my suspicion that I have subconsciously already made a great start on the sequel to this book. And I say subconsciously because a few months ago I was pretty sure that this would be a standalone, but now, as I look back, I can see that I've sort of been secretly leaving myself a trail of breadcrumbs that leads to the next book, and quite simply I have to write it. And that feeling of having to write an idea is actually something that comes up in today's chat with Melanie McGrath. So perhaps that's as close as I'll get to a segue today, and we should just crack on with today's interview. So Melanie is a self-proclaimed Essex girl, co-founder of Killer Women, and an award-winning writer of fiction and non-fiction. As MJ McGrath, she writes the acclaimed Edie Kiglatuk series of Arctic mysteries, White Heat, The Boy in the Snow and The Boneseeker, twice longlisted for the CWA Gold Dagger, and picked as Times and Financial Times Thrillers of the Year. And as Melanie McGrath, she's written several critically acclaimed non-fiction books, with her most recent being Pie and Mash Down the Roman Road. It's always lovely to talk to Melanie, but this was the first time we got to chat face to face in Mel's home in London back in August. It was fascinating to hear how Mel approaches her non-fiction projects in pretty much a very similar way to how she approaches her fiction, and I think there's something in this interview for writers of all genres, so enjoy. Okay, Mel, thanks a million to coming on the show again, and this time in person. We actually get to meet in person for once. Which is
such a pleasure.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to see you. So, we've talked loads before about all your fiction and various different genres, and we've touched a little bit about the fact that you write non-fiction, but we haven't really talked about that in much detail. So, I thought, for just to start us off, just remind us of some of the books that you've worked on in terms of non-fiction. Talk us through some of the projects that you've done there.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think of myself as a storyteller, really. So I'm very interested in narrative. So if there's a good story to be had out there, then that's what I'm going to write about. So that's led me to write about all manner of things in non-fiction. I guess if I were to say that I specialised in anything, it's social history, and particularly the social history of East London, which is where my family are from. I can actually trace my family back for about 250, 300 years back to that part of London. So, yeah, that's mostly what it's about. And I like to tell the stories of people whose stories wouldn't otherwise be told.
Well, that's a great way of putting it, which kind of gives us a good feel for your latest book. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Pie and Mash on the Roman Road?
Pie and Mash, it came to me. I'm always looking for interesting stories to tell about the East End, because I think the East End of London is a crucible for the most extraordinary history, certainly urban history in the UK, actually, from my point of view, and not just because my family were there, but because so much happened there and so many flows of people came in and out and all of that. I've always loved the old businesses that managed to survive, the old family businesses. There's a kind of incredible romance about them. And I'm a bit of a porker, so I love food. I love food. So these two things kind of came together in Pie and Mash. I wanted to write about pie and mash and eels, which is the kind of known as the Londoner's meal, and sort of encapsulates something about London and Londoners. And I wanted to write about one of the very oldest of the pie and mash families, the Kellys, there are three big pie and mash families in London: the Kellys, the Manseys, and the Cooks. And I could have chosen any of them, actually, but part of the reason I chose the Kellys was that they're on the Roman Road, and the Roman Road is, as it says on the tin, the road that the Romans came down and founded Londinium, founded the city. So you've got, although I focus on the 20th century, that kind of 100 or so years that Kelly's business has been going in the Roman Road, I do go back right to the time of the Romans. And one of the things that most fascinated me about pie and mash and eels, which is so associated with London, is that all the elements in that, or virtually all the elements in that meal, are actually immigrants. They might have come to London a very, very long time ago. For example, the Romans brought pastry, and they got the idea from the Greeks, and the Greeks nicked it from the Egyptians. And all eels come from Jamaica. That's where they're sort of born and bred, and then they make the great crossing across the Atlantic to Europe. And then they go back again to breed if they haven't been eaten and jellied first. So it seemed like, there was a kind of whole rich world of metaphor and history and stories there. So I started with the pie shop, and I spent quite a lot of time in there talking to the customers, talking to people who work there. And it's one of those businesses where everyone knows everyone else, and people were soon saying, oh, you need to talk to X and you need to talk to Y, and this person just loves her jellied eels. This person used to work in the market, on the market stall next to the shop. And gradually I built up this kind of tapestry of people, all of whom had come into the shop and out of the shop at one time. And it sort of felt to me like, their stories felt to me like emblematic, really, of London stories generally, and the stories of people, the flows of people in and out, and their stories in London, which is also, I imagine, very similar to Manchester and Liverpool and Newcastle and Edinburgh and all the other big cities in the UK. So, yeah, I started little and I worked out, really.
And what did the family say when you first said, "Oh, I'd like to write a book about this"? What was their reaction?
Well, Neil, who's the youngest member of the family, so he would be the great-grandson of the founder. He was very... he's young, he's got big plans for the pie and mash shop, which was thrilling to me to hear, because so many of our traditional businesses are closing down, and our high streets are looking more and more homogenous. And that was another thing I loved about the Roman Road. It's still full of family businesses. So he was really upbeat and really up for it. His mum Sue, whose story I tell in the book, was a bit more wary, I would say, and she's kind of got to the end of her working life. So she got more enthusiastic as the project went along. I think I've found before in dealing with kind of particularly working class social history that the people you talk to are people who've no one's ever talked to before, and people haven't really taken an interest in, particularly in their lives. So they often the first hurdle to get over is why you're actually interested in them. And I'm interested in them for precisely those reasons, because they've got ordinary lives. And most of us are not Arctic explorers or, great politicians, or most of us are ordinary. And for me, that's where the magic is.
And so it's that ordinary story. So when you first decide, I mean, do you tend to have like multiple of these kind of projects on the go at the same time, or at least floating around in the ether? Do you think, I'm quite interested in that, I'm quite interested in that? And if so, how do you decide what's the one that you decide to go for at any one time?
You always have, but I always have one fiction on the go and one non-fiction on the go, and they may be at different stages, but they require different things of me. And I like, because I guess I started life as a journalist, I like to have that connection to real people out there. And I like to be able to go and talk to people, and it stops me from going mad, sitting at my desk all day, kind of staring at a screen, making things up. I do think, I love writing fiction, but I do also think non-fiction gives you the chance to tell the stories of people who are like us. In fiction, your characters are usually quite heightened, and certainly in crime fiction, which is the kind of thing I write, they get into all manner of
a point of crisis that you tend to join them at,
but I find there's a huge amount of magic in people's lives if you can only draw it out of them, and that's the goal, really. So when I'm in that project, to answer your question, when I'm in one of those non-fiction projects, it's quite all-consuming. The pie and mash on the Roman Road, I spent day after day after day tramping up and down the Roman Road, getting contacts, just being seen, so that I got to the point where I could arrive and people would approach me and they know who I was, and I would sit in the same cafes and I'd go to the pie shop at a certain time, and news travels fast, and people would come and talk to me about their lives or the lives of people they thought were of particular interest. So, I ended up talking to boxers, I ended up talking to associates of the Craze, I ended up talking to the 90-something old lady who manned the toilets for 60 years, I think. And there's nothing passes you by if you man the toilets. Stall holders, the guy who makes those traditional East End barrows, the market barrows, people who made the pies, people who dealt the potatoes at Spitalfields, all manner of people. And you only get that kind of by footwork, really. You only get that by going there, making yourself known. You don't get that in libraries. You don't get that in other books. You get that real sense of lived experience by talking to people. So while I'm doing that, I may talk to, I think there's probably about, maybe there's like 40 people in Pie and Mash. But in order to get those stories, I probably talked to 140 people. And it was those 40 people whose stories I felt were strong enough, were emblematic enough. People who, some people have just, I think particularly in working class communities, actually, and I've definitely seen it in Glasgow and in Liverpool, and they have this wonderful way of talking because they have very oral cultures. And when you find an old East Ender who can talk proper Cockney, you're made, because it's poetry. And I used some of their speech directly in the book, and some of it I've kind of paraphrased. But where people have used language in a way that's particularly expressive, I thought...
There's no better way to say it.
No. I mean, no. And I wouldn't presume to be able to say it in a way that's better or more poetic, or gives you more of a feel for their real experience than the way that they've put it. And again, you know, some people will remember... I mean, I guess I probably talked to about five of the maybe 140 people who had such vivid memories. It took my breath away. From the war, most of them were old. From the war, from the old days of the old markets, from the old days of Petticoat Lane, from the old days of boxing, whatever it was. And when you get someone like that, it's like finding a piece of gold. You just know it, and it's absolutely magic. And that's something I get when I come home from meeting with one of those people, from finding one of those people. I'm like on a huge high, and you don't get that from fiction. What I was going to say was, of those 5 who I can think of and name, 3 were illiterate, are illiterate, and I think that's no coincidence, actually, because they can't write. They haven't been able to read and write. They've stored all this stuff up in their minds, and when it comes out, it sort of comes out as if it's for the first time, and they're still a 6-year-old in the Blitz, and it's magical.
It's just really, really vivid.
Yeah, and the names and so on, because they haven't been able to rely on reading names, and the names of other businesses, the names of other people, names of signs, the way things smelled, the way things you felt, the sound of things. It tends to be much more vivid in people who can't read, weirdly.
It makes sense, though, really. I haven't thought about it like that, but it does make sense. And how do you go from a technical standpoint? So how do you record that? Do you record audio? Do you take notes? Do you rush back and write, in inverted commas, a scene up? How do you approach that side of things?
I would generally take notes and audio, and I was conscious that a lot of the people I interviewed were quite elderly, and that they probably wouldn't be around for very much longer, and that some of them had really important things to say. You know, their grandmother was a suffragette, or they had really important historical parts of the historical record, or how it felt to be a kid in the Blitz, or whatever. So I wanted to record that, and I'm hoping to get the funding to put that in the archives, the local history archives in Tower Hamlets, so that other researchers in the future can listen to those. But as I'm going through interviewing people, I let them speak. So they might trundle on for half an hour about their their woes or their ills, or how cold it is or whatever. But then that gives them time to settle in. It gives you time to settle in, and you get a much better response from people when you're just letting them tell their stories. It's not a journalistic interview, so it's not like me firing questions at them, because very often stuff will come up that they've never said before. I mean, 2 or 3 people told me things that they'd never told anyone before, because no one had asked them. So, and if I just asked them questions, I just would have got the responses to those questions. So it's a huge amount of sorting and sifting. When you get back from an interview, having recorded it, I'm also taking notes. So I'm looking at the time clock, not so that they can't see, because there's nothing worse than them thinking that I'm impatient. I'm looking at the time clock, and I'm noting when they tell a really fantastic story, so I can then go back and transcribe that story from the tape, and I don't have to transcribe 4 hours of tape or 8 hours of tape, which is a huge task. And if you give it to someone else, it's massively expensive. So, so then I'll have a sense of, I built a huge file of all my interviewees, and I'd already had a sense of the people whose stories I probably wanted to focus on. But generally speaking, there'll be periods of their life where there's more going on, more of interest than others. And so part of the task for me is to include all that fabulous, wonderful, rich material, but to create an overall narrative for the reader so that the reader can move smoothly from one of these wonderful stories into another of these wonderful stories, and kind of follow the characters through life. So the characters will come in and out as they've got something interesting going on in their lives.
And so do you tend to think of it as kind of an overarching timeline or narrative, and then try and fit these little jigsaw pieces in as you go, would you say?
Yeah, so this particular book is chronological broadly, but it's also thematic. So obviously during the war, that kind of sorts itself out really, but most of the periods are not during Great World Wars.
Sure, yeah.
So I've taken things like, so for example, one of the characteristics of the East End in the 60s was, particularly down the Roman Road, the Roman Road was a huge market for fashion, and there were lots and lots of clothes manufacturers nearby then, and the women would work on these clothes, and they'd often kind of secretly do seconds, so that they would then be picked up on Roman Road Market and sold. So you would be making a Mary Quant dress in the day and kind of slightly faking it, and so that you could go at the weekend and buy it as a second for pittance in the market. So since the 60s is sort of very associated with, and the other thing that happened in the 60s was a lot of crooners, a lot of East End crooners. So the 60s period, I focused on kind of fashion and youth culture and music, and all of which was really vibrant in the 60s. And the 70s, it was a darker period. So there's always something thematic. It's rather, it's like a very sort of sophisticated process of filing, where you've got to file things, but you've also immediately got to know where they are and what you've filed. It's very different from fiction in that way. And I often think of it as, in fiction, it's like you've got to make something out of nothing. So it's almost like you've got a ball of clay and you've got to fabricate it into something that's got a shape. And with non-fiction, it's almost like a great blob of clay is put down in front of you, and you've got to chip bits away and carve bits to make
like
it
kind
look
of sculpture almost. You're just given like a block of some material, and you've got to hack away at it until something emerges from within it. Yeah,
that looks coherent. It's got a shape, and you can see it's got a form. But within it's got kind of lots and lots of different elements. So it's sort of the kind of opposite of writing fiction. And again, it's one of the things that I love about having both one of each on the go. It means I never stop working, but I like working, so that's all right.
And I was going to ask you about that though. From a headspace point of view, are you able to do that because they are kind of very different kind of approaches that you use for it, fiction and non-fiction?
Yeah, but I think maybe it's a journalistic training. You've always got a ton of ideas in your head, and they all sort of bubble under, and then one of them emerges. So the other day I was pitching 2 more novel ideas to my editor, and I sat down, we went out to lunch, and I sat down and I'd thought about the ideas and I'd written pitches, so I had them firmly in my head. And I pitched one idea, and that was fine. And then I went to pitch the second idea, and something completely different came out of my mouth, which I hadn't even, until that point, I hadn't even knew was in my head, let alone was going to come out of my mouth. And as I was saying it, somewhere in my subconscious, it had been brewing away and bubbling, and it's it felt more urgent suddenly than the idea that
you'd got to pitch.
Getting the instinct for that, or trusting your intuition for that, I think is something that comes with experience, really. And if something's really knocking loudly on your door, then open the door.
And in terms of style, and as you talk about, people tell stories and truth and everything else, and you're writing what is essentially a social history there, which, is predominantly true. It's based on true stories, but you take in this social history from people. Is that something that you are particularly bothered about, or do you think, well, hang on a minute, I want to create an atmosphere and kind of tell a particular story within this? I'm not saying that you make stuff up, but I mean, is it more about creating an atmosphere and driving towards a certain thing with it?
Yeah. I want people to feel that they're experiencing what these families have experienced or what these people have experienced. And I want them to, laugh and cry and feel these people's lived experience. What you're saying is absolutely true. People remember things in the way that they remember them. And we all know, if you've got siblings and you talk about something that happened, a Christmas that happened, when you were 10, you'll get a number of stories of the number of siblings you've got. So my rule is that I will always check things that are verifiable.
Sure.
So, for example, there's a guy in the book, Gary Arbour, who's had a very, very old family printing business, and they printed the Crays, flyers for the Crays when they were boxers, but they also printed suffragette leaflets for Sylvia Pankhurst, and sort of everything in between. And Gary remembers this event as a 6-year-old boy at the start of the war, and he remembers the war being declared, and his parents were listening to it on a crystal set, and it was on a Sunday, and they were just about to make Sunday lunch, but they call it dinner. And he remembers this plane going over as a 6-year-old, and it had the Iron Cross on the underneath of the plane. So it was a Nazi plane. And he told himself, he's now 80-something, and he's told himself all his life since he was 6 that was the German ambassador leaving, after the declaration of war, leaving London for Berlin. And I checked it with the German embassy, and of course the Germans, being Germans, got all the records.
It's very accurate.
And it wasn't actually. He'd conflated two events. The German ambassador had left like a month before to go on holiday, and it could well have been something that Gary had seen, but he didn't see it on that day. So that I can verify. There's all kinds of things I can't verify, and I don't want to verify, because when you're talking about lived experience, what someone says about their lived experience is true.
It's the truth.
It's
of the
true
experience.
to them. Yeah, it's true to them. So, if they say, if they describe the sound of a doodle bug, and it's not the way that other people would describe it, it doesn't mean it's not true. It's
how they experience
it. It's their own experience, and I'm very clear about that. When people get dates wrong, or they get bus routes wrong, or they get the names of shops wrong, or that kind of stuff, that stuff can be verified, and I have a responsibility to verify it, because just writing something down puts it on the record. When it's something to do with their subjective lived experience, then I've no right to interfere with that at all, and I wouldn't. And I think the beauty and the magic of that is that you get all this patchwork of different lived experiences, and the way different people see the same event, and the way that different people see their lives. And that's what fascinates me personally about history. I'm much more interested in that than I am in who was Prime Minister in 1911. P.S. I can't tell you.
Good. Okay, let's take a quick break there for this week's Book Bloggers Corner. And this week, Catherine Sunderland, aka Bibliomaniac, reviews The Way of All Flesh by Ambrose Parry.
This is the BBC Book Bloggers Corner.
Powerful and thrilling novel set in the gritty underworld of Edinburgh in 1847, where the bodies of young women are being discovered throughout the old town. Running alongside the mystery of these gruesome deaths is the story of Will Raven, a medical student about to start his apprenticeship with Dr. Simpson. At the house of Dr. Simpson, Raven meets housemaid Sarah Fisher. Sarah is a bright, intelligent woman with insight and skill beyond her role as a housemaid, but restricted by her class, access to further opportunities and medical education are beyond her reach. However, Raven and Sarah each have a reason to find out more about the deaths of the young women in Edinburgh, and in doing so, find themselves thrown together in the shadows of the dark underworld, where they have to overcome their differences in order to save themselves. This novel has so many strengths, but one of the most obvious is the powerful descriptions of Edinburgh and the wonderful evocation of life in the 1840s. The pages are crammed with imagery and details which capture the historical setting so well that the reader is very firmly rooted in the time and the place. The descriptions are excellent. Use of object, sense, dialogue and observation enhances the imagery, and I was completely immersed in the era, inhabiting the pages alongside the characters. I thought Raven and Sarah were both very well-formed, complex characters who had depths and intrigue. Again, they were easy to relate to, easy to imagine, and felt very rounded and carefully crafted. They both had their own stories, issues, motivations and journeys, and these were evenly handled, coming together in a way which increased tension and suspense. They worked well as protagonists, both contrasting and complementing each other, which again enhanced the plot and the writing. This is an intensely atmospheric read, gruesome, gritty and dark, with a storyline that is both thrilling and fascinating. It's fresh and original and combines a great storyline with a really interesting exploration of women, pregnancy, opportunities and breakthroughs in medical science. I've not really read anything like it before, and I'm very much looking forward to reading anything further from Ambrose Parry. I would highly recommend this book to readers who enjoy both crime and historical fiction, and for anyone who enjoys an intelligent, well-crafted, atmospheric novel.
Book Bloggers Corner.
There you go, that was The Way of All Flesh by Ambrose Parry, and you can find a link to that in the show notes, along with a link to Catherine's own blog that's got loads of great book reviews and recommendations. Right, let's get back to my chat now with Melanie McGrath, where I asked Mel about how she works towards wrapping up on her non-fiction projects. How do you decide when you've got what you need, and also, did you have lots of difficult decisions in terms of which stories you didn't use?
I'll tackle the last one first. Yes, I did have lots of difficult decisions about what I should and shouldn't leave out. And some of those were ethical, and some of those were about people who'd done me huge favours, but whose stories didn't fit. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why I am putting all the material that I can into the archives, so that all the stuff that I couldn't use will be there somewhere, because I'm conscious that people gave their time, and not only their time, they dragged up their memories, which was sometimes quite painful for them. There were things that I made decisions to use that were difficult for people. So one example would be a chap called Ted Lewis, who sadly died during the time I was writing the book. Was an amazing guy, and wonderful man, and his sons have written to me to say how proud they are to see him in the book. So I'm very proud that I was able to write his life story. Anyway, boxer, Billingsgate fish porter, had a big life. His father was a fascist. So his father was in Oswald Mosley's team. And he had told me that, but what he hadn't told me was that his father was actually the British Union of Fascists candidate for Whitechapel. Right. And he also hadn't told me that his father was illiterate. And because of this, his father would go round on various soapboxes in the East End, and he'd learnt one speech, and he would give the speech. And his opponents would always turn up, whatever soapbox he was on, and they would recite this speech back to him, but like a paragraph ahead to
Ready,
completely throw him. And I found that little detail, and I thought, that's just such a lovely little detail, I'm going to use it. But of course I had to go back to Ted and say, look, I found out that your father wasn't, he was active politically for the fascists, and I'm going to put that in the book. So then there were one or two other...
And how did he react when you told him that?
He was a great respecter of history, so he respected it, which I have all the more respect for him for. So there are quite big life issues that you have to tackle and make decisions about whether or not you're going to use them. And I think it's about whether you can do justice to that person's story without using them. And if you can do full justice to that person's story without using those sensitive things, then you probably have a duty to do that. I mean, I'm not in the business of trashing people's lives. But if you can't tell the story that you need to tell and you feel needs to be told without doing that, then I think the very least you can do is to go and talk to the person that's going to be affected. Yeah, I mean, you get the story first and then you do the negotiations afterwards, I'm afraid. There has to be a little element of ruthlessness. And also, you don't know what you're going to get until you start talking to people. So there's no point in kind of backing off and setting them up for something that, it's then turns out to be fine.
So some of that research stuff must be quite hard to do. It's obviously very meticulous. I mean, it has to be done. As you say, you've got a moral and a legal obligation to do it. But so what sorts of things, how do you go about investigating some of those things that you have to... How do you find out, like, for example, with the fascist, how did you find out those little details? Where did they come from? From other interviews or...
That particular thing happened to be that my partner has a fascination with Lord Haw-Haw, who
Right.
was a kind of fascist sympathiser and broadcast from Nazi Germany. He was American, but he broadcast to the Brits from Nazi Germany, and he happened to be reading a biography of Haw-Haw and saw the name and thought, haven't I seen that name somewhere before? And alerted me to that. But other times it'll be... things, online resources like ancestry.com, which is an amazing resource. And I think I was able to tell people about ancestors that they had been researching for 15 years and weren't able to find, because I've got a good eye for research, and because I know that, for example, if someone's got a foreign sounding name in 1850, the likelihood is it's going to be spelt wrong. Mm-hmm. So you try all kinds of variations of the name, and then eventually you'll find the link. And it's that kind of research that people who are not used to research wouldn't necessarily do themselves or know how to do themselves. I was assisted by the local history library in Tower Hamlets. They're sitting on this unbelievably rich wealth of East End history, and they're also brilliant. And you can walk in there and say, the florist on X Street, in 1833, and they'll lead you to the resource that tells you not only about the florist, but who owned it and where they got their flowers from, and, whether they sold more poppies than lavender or whatever. They're amazing. So, and they want to help. So you make the most of those resources.
You crack on with it. So if somebody was starting out today... They've had an idea maybe for some time that they want to try non-fiction. What would be, if you got any kind of tips, how should they start out? How should they approach it initially?
I think it's what's the story? What is the story you want to tell? And facts aren't stories, and stories aren't facts. So just because you've got a ton of facts, it doesn't mean you've got a story. And how do you frame your story in a way that makes it interesting and relevant for other people? So is it about a universal human emotion or a universal human dilemma? And that will make a story. A lot of people who read Pie and Mash won't have grown up in the East End of London, but they will have had relatives who had the same dilemmas, who went through the same experiences, who had the same desires, the same needs. So what human question are you answering with your story? And I guess for Pie and Mash it would be what I actually quote in the epilogue, which is what has to change for everything to stay the same. So in a city, everything changes, but there are fundamental things that stay the same, just as in a human life. That's true. So I think it's looking for those kind of associations, those connections that make the story universal, a universal human story. And you'll always find those, but it often means laying your research down and not looking at it and forgetting it for a bit, and not getting over involved in the research and thinking about the story that you want to tell.
That's really, really good advice. So what have you got next? What have you got on the go at the moment? Are you working on a non-fiction at the moment, presumably?
I am working on an idea.
Anything that you can talk about, or you're not ready to talk about it?
I'm not ready to. My agent says I should keep stum about it, but it's different. It's not London. It's something more personal, I would say, and yeah. So hopefully, I won't be ready to write it for a bit. But hopefully when I do, I will. I'll email you and we can have a talk about it. But it's really difficult for me not to talk about it because I'm bursting to talk about it.
So when you say you're not ready, I'm not asking you specifically about that project. Obviously, you can't talk about it. But is it this idea? I get the impression you're similar with your fiction as well. You sort of almost have to work yourself up to a certain point where you're like, right now I'm ready to go and write it.
Yeah, it has to kind of, it's like making a, really good pasta sauce. It has to kind of bubble away for a bit, doesn't it? And then eventually it kind of tells you itself that it's done. You can see by the look of it or the smell or whatever that it's done. And then you're ready to go. Brilliant.
And where can people find you online, Mel, if they want to get in touch or follow you on social media?
I love people to get in touch. I love people to tell me what they thought of the books, good or bad. I love that. It's any connection to readers is fantastic. So I'm at McGrathMJ on Twitter. I'm melaniemcgrath.com on the interweb. And I'm in Facebook somewhere. I think I'm MJ McGrath in Facebook. But anyway, I'm quite easy to find. We've
talked about this before. You've got too many pseudonyms.
I have. Yeah, I've got an permanent identity crisis.
But I'll put those in the show notes as well. But for now, that's great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Wayne. I enjoyed it.
Okay, thanks again to Melanie, and I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk, and you should check out Pie and Mash Down the Roman Road right now from all good book stockists. Okay, that wraps things up for this week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website, plus blog series for the NaNoWriMo thing, and lots of other blog posts coming down the track as well. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts from, to have the show downloaded automatically every week. Also, remember to get in touch with all your writing news, views, questions, comments, or whatever, and tweet me with where you're listening to the show and why you enjoy the show, and I'll give you a mention in a future programme. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing and reading, and I'll see you next time.
Joined up